In the midst of all the cutbacks and hardships that Milei is asking the people of Argentina to endure, it seems that funding can be found for spending on some projects. But what or who is behind the generous budget increases for the military and security forces? President Milei is an economist. He's also fond of the same self-aggrandizing hyperbole as his idol Donald Trump, so by his own accounts, Milei may be the greatest economist ever, even going so far as to suggest that he should be considered for a Nobel Prize. That may be taking things a little too far just yet. However, he does seem to be working minor miracles with the Argentine economy, having, for now at least, apparently put the brakes on inflation. But at what cost? Poverty is skyrocketing and businesses are closing, possibly making Milei's economic miracle just a temporary fix. Much of this success has been achieved by simply cutting costs from the national budget. Subsidies on transport, food, medicine and power have been almost completely removed. Ministries which don't fit the government's libertarian political agenda, particularly those concerned with human rights and equality, have been closed completely. And inefficient publicly owned or funded companies are being made ready for privatization. And whenever challenged over these deep cutbacks, the answer is simple: there's no money. It's been easy to see for a long time that Argentina has lived way beyond its means. This, alongside rampant corruption, has run up huge international debts, for which the state continually defaulted on the repayments. And the mantra of "there's no money" would be totally believable and acceptable if it were not for one small detail. Among these endless cutbacks, one area of government has received very generous spending: the military. Hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent on upgrading equipment, including the purchase of a couple of dozen of F-16 fighter jets. This comes after decades of underinvestment, but considering the generally peaceful environment of southern South America, it's difficult to justify prioritizing defense spending over poverty relief. Choosing a vice president or deputy prime minister is generally a political strategy rather than a meeting of like minds. The choice is usually a concession to some political faction whose support the leader needs to get into power and govern effectively. Beyond a public display of allegiance, it's possible that a president and his VP agree on very little, something which paralysed the government of Alberto Fernandez, Milei's predecessor. Amongst all his showmanship and chainsaw-wielding bluster, Javier Milei has never really struck me as a militarist, and I certainly didn't expect him to prioritise military spending in contrast to all his other cost-cutting. His vice president, on the other hand, the quietly spoken Victoria Villarruel, is rather different. She comes from a military family, and high on her agenda is said to be the righting of some perceived wrongs and restoring a sense of national pride in the armed forces. It could be Villarruel's hand behind the large military parade on Independence Day, which recently stroked Milei's ego. And generous spending on the military could be part of the bargain Milei struck in return for Villarruel's support. Just this week, the budget was extended to incorporate another $100 million of spending on reorganizing Argentina's national intelligence services and restoring the former CIDE agency, despite its somewhat checkered history. It's more than 40 years now since Argentina's return to democracy after a period of brutal dictatorship and internal repression. Argentina, along with most other Latin American nations, fell victim to the USA's Cold War games, and many ordinary citizens paid a high price at the hands of national intelligence services. Despite the best efforts of preceding governments, wounds have never completely healed. The Kirchner governments of the 2000s put on trial a lot of the aging dictators and torturers, a move that was generally seen as long overdue, and threw most of them in prison. The then government set up agencies to dig into the history of the dictatorship and excavate sites connected with torture and disappearances. Many mass graves have been found, and investigations have continued until now. As part of the harsh budget cuts, all funding into such historical research has been put on hold or completely withdrawn. The government says that it's a waste of resources. Voices within Milei's government, most vocally the vice president herself, have said that many convictions and much of the research has been politically driven by an earlier government with strong connections to the left-wing insurgents who fought against the military government during what's known as the Dirty War. They say that many convictions are unsafe and should be overturned, and that members of the various anti-government terrorist groups should be held to account for their crimes, none of whom have ever been brought to trial. There have been recent reports in the media about visits to those imprisoned for crimes against humanity by members of Milei's La Libertad Avanza party. These have been dismissed by the government, saying that any visits were as private citizens and not as representatives of the government or the party. More than half of Argentina's current population were born after those times and know only what they've been told or not told in school, in curriculums defined by the agendas of whatever government happens to be in power. I imagine the new government is already busy rewriting textbooks to fit with its particular narrative on the subject. And as for people who did live through the 1976-1983 period of political repression, few want to talk about it. In my 20 or so years living in Argentina, I have never had a full conversation with anyone about those times, only hints and whispers. Maybe I've just never met the right people. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this video interesting. If you did, please give it a like. And if you're not already subscribed, you might want to do that too. If you want to support the channel, you can buy me a coffee in the link below. And until next time, que tengas un buen día.